Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good break and a good lunch. Let me begin by thanking you all for being here. And in addition to that, congratulate again Asan for their 10th anniversary. This has been a wonderful forum that I've had the pleasure and honor of participating in for a number of years in a row. And it's one of the most valuable things that I do. And it's a particular honor for me to be able to moderate this particular panel with such a distinguished group of friends and colleagues of long standing. And I'm particularly delighted because we have an opportunity as we come into the home stretch of this 2 days of discussion to talk about the Northeast Asia region as a whole. And as the region contends with the reality, the stark reality of the illiberal international order, and as it deals with the need to try to sustain and defend and, if possible, revitalize the liberal international order, which has so greatly benefited this region. Looking at this region, one of the things that really struck me in the conversation yesterday was Chaebong's excellent point in which he said that the Republic of Korea is the poster child of the liberal international order. I thought that was a very apt turn of phrase because South Korea has indeed been a tremendous beneficiary of and product of that liberal international order. And South Korea, together with Japan, of course, in this region, the two serve as central pillars of the liberal international order. And they both, of course, have a major stake in its preservation. Meanwhile, this region, Northeast Asia, is one where the tectonic plates of the liberal and the illiberal international orders are bumping up against each other in interesting and provocative ways. And we are witnessing in the region and on the periphery of the region some troubling developments, including in Russia and some would say in China as well. And where one country in particular, North Korea, provides an example for us of the dangers of the prospective triumph of the illiberal international order. To discuss all of these things and more, we have a really distinguished group of colleagues and friends who are known to all of you. I won't go and introduce each one of them and give you their bio. You have that material, but I don't think there's anybody in this room who doesn't know this distinguished group on the dais with me. And each one of them is going to share with you their important perspectives. And I've asked them to focus primarily on the future of the liberal international order. Not so much talk about where we've been and how we got here, but where we are and where we may be going. And one question that I hope in particular our Republic of Korea and our Japanese colleagues will address is whether there is a belief in both of those countries that the United States, which of course has been the traditional sustainer and protector of the liberal international order, whether the United States can continue to be relied upon in the current situation to play that role. Yesterday, we heard a very vigorous defense in the keynote speech that was delivered at the opening of yesterday's session, a very vigorous defense of President Trump, of his approach to diplomacy and leadership, and Trumpism, a term that I hadn't heard used in a public forum like this in a while. It was very interesting to hear it described that way. I don't think it's any secret that many believe that President Trump's administration has not played the role of the sustainer and protector of that liberal international orders in the same manner as previous administrations. And the result of that, in the view of some, has been to allow the illiberal trend to flourish and proliferate. And I hope each one of the panelists here today will share their thoughts, frank thoughts, either in support of that contention or in opposition to that contention. And so with those opening remarks, and without any further ado, let's begin. I've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 7 or 8 minutes, or perhaps a little bit longer, to keep their remarks brief and punchy and future-oriented. And let me begin with Professor Yong of Korea University. Professor Lee.
Thank you. Is it on? Should be. Okay. Thank you. So I thank Asan Institute for inviting me to this wonderful panel. I think I must start by saying that I'm very much handicapped today because I should have talked about liberal international order just prior to summit meeting of two Koreas. So the outcome of this summit meeting would have saved me a lot from making mistakes. So with that note, I start off my talk with my brief assessment of where liberal international order is in Northeast Asia. Then on the basis of an assumption that Northeast Asian state might want to take steps toward the making of liberal international order in the region, I suggest 2 factors that can help sustain such efforts. One is the importance of cultivating cooperative security arrangement in the region. For this part, I will highlight the notion of associative balance of power as a practical solution to reduce security dilemma facing Northeast Asia. The other is the importance of tackling socio-economic inequality within each state. So when it comes to current status of liberal order in Northeast Asia, I argue that liberal order has not been scaled back in the region. It is simply because we don't have fully fledged functioning liberal order to scale down in the first place. So let's put aside more difficult security affairs and North Korea for the moment. And let's just talk about some economic relations. In short, we don't have any meaningful multilateral economic framework in the region, despite the fact that countries in Northeast Asia entertain unprecedented level of economic interdependence. To give you just one example, China, Japan, and Korea have been negotiating their trilateral free trade agreements for years. As of today, we don't see any meaningful progress on it. As such, rule of law, multilateralism in Northeast Asia have been just partially applied across the board. Therefore, real question for the future of liberal order in Northeast Asia is whether or not states in the region will decide to weave together bits and pieces of liberal elements of order to make it happen, rather than worrying about demise of liberal order. That's my first point. Then how do we start the making of liberal order in Northeast Asia? First, I think Northeast Asia may want to devise measures to shift their security relations from comparative to cooperative security. For this to happen in short to medium-term range, I suggest that regional states can take advantage of implementing the practice of associative balance of power. Associative balance of power, one of the 2 kinds of balance of power politics that Hans Morgenthau identified a long time ago, along with traditional, more adversarial balance of power politics. In short, associative balance of power is practice of pursuing strategic rivalries under common roof of standards of action. One historical example of this associative balance of power is the 1987 Stockholm Agreement that dealt with East and West divide and tension. The measures taken at Stockholm Agreement included regular policy level, security dialogues, exchange of defense white papers and annual plans of military activities, and finally, invitation to observe military exercises. I think adopting a associative balance of power, which is short of multilateral security arrangement in the region, is not panacea by any means, but can be a practical step forward in the context of regional states' divergent strategic concerns. Second, and more briefly, I think addressing socio-economic inequality within each state is indispensable to sustaining liberal order in Northeast Asia. We cannot continue liberal order without domestic support for free flows of goods, services, and people. In my view, negative impact of socio-economic inequality on liberal order can be much larger in the historical context of Northeast Asia because it can be easily linked up to inflammable nationalism. After all, I think freedom and equality are not antithetical to each other. Rather, I think they stand in mutually conditioning relationship. Last but not least, I argue that no variables can substitute leaders. Liberal order can be made within Northeast Asia only when leaders in the region put their conscious effort in initiating the process and carefully cultivating it down the road. Okay, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Very interesting concept, this associative balance of power, and I want to come back to that during the round of Q&A coming up. Next on the list is a good friend and colleague of longstanding, Doug Paal. And Doug, in your remarks, I wonder if you can touch on something that you and I chatted about a little bit earlier, and that is many see China's current political trajectory, domestic political trajectory, as manifesting a very troubling illiberal trend. And is that your view? And if it's not, if you can tell us why not, and if it is, if you can share your thoughts about the implications of that for our ability to preserve the liberal international order as we've known it. Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Evans. And I'll join the ritual, the group of those who've thanked Asan for this wonderful opportunity and repeat effort, which I very much appreciate every year. From my brief remarks today, I'm not going to focus on short-term diplomacy and yes or no on the results of Friday's summit or the Trump-Kim summit, but try to look longer term. And I'll try to get to your question, Evans, as I go along. There was an article written about 6 years ago by Bob Manning and Evan Feigenbaum in Foreign Policy, in which they talked about economic Asia and security Asia. And they drew a big contrast between the mighty giant of economic Asia and the little midget of security Asia, the big disparity between the economic interdependency of the various economies of the region and the maturity of those economies, and the immaturity and the incapacity of security mechanisms in the region. And with that in mind, I wanted to look at and follow up this morning's panel where there was some discussion, especially by Ambassador Lippert, on the issue of continuity and discontinuity in the Trump administration. Like Ambassador Lippert, I do see a lot of continuity on the security side. I see less on the economic side, although Trump has been trying very hard to portray himself to the American people especially as a disruptor, someone trying to change the previous pattern of behavior, and I know he's made life hell for Korean negotiators and others in the region, as they have in Northeast Asia and the rest of the Pacific region have responded rather intelligently to the rejection of TPP by President Trump to come up with CPTPP 11 and to try to save the best of the piece that could be saved. and hope that it'll be a foundation for the future. The administration's position on TPP in itself reflects a kind of continuity. There was a very strong prospect that if President Obama had the fortitude to push the TPP through as legislation in the last 2 years of his administration, the Congress would have rejected it. And in the end, as was discussed by Jim Steinberg yesterday, the presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, who had been a champion of TPP, herself rejected it in the hopes of getting elected. So there's a systemic problem there, and Trump may not be the real problem himself. There's something bigger, and we've been discussing that in other panels. Trump has been trying on security as well to be a disruptor. And the early rhetoric that he employed in the campaign of making people pay for their various protections around the world, trying to bargain over every alliance relationship, most of that language has evaporated with time. What's been missing is a substitute for the kind of projection of a future security relationship that embraces the change in the region and that sort of catches up with this midget versus giant dichotomy between the economy and the security mechanisms that are available to us. The one valiant effort that's been made by the administration to come up with a security concept was also previously discussed in panels, the free and open Indo-Pacific. This was an idea that had, again, continuity behind it. Admiral Harris, who may soon be visiting us here in a new capacity, has long talked about the Indo-Pacific as his bailiwick from the east coast of Africa across the Pacific, quite natural. But that was not what fed the idea into the national security strategy of the United States as published in December and in the National Defense Strategy as in January. In that case, the authors of the strategy were desperately looking for a theme, especially a theme they could put into President Trump's speeches in Beijing and Da Nang and at the ARF meeting in the November meetings that he attended in East Asia. And fortunately, some Japanese diplomats came along and said, why don't you try free and open Indo-Pacific and Quad? And like a light bulb going off over the heads of the authors of the report, they grabbed it and ran with it, but never quite injected it with any substance. It's sort of a handy moniker, but not much more in terms of substance. It is an inarticulated and suboptimal formula, but and it has its origins. This focus on East Asia, as was mentioned by Ambassador Lippert, he cited Mike Green. You can take this back to the transition in 1990-91 as the Cold War wrapped up. The Carl Ford, especially at the Defense Department under then Secretary Cheney, promoted the East Asian Strategy Initiative, which was an effort to get ahead of congressional bargain hunting to try to cut our bases in Korea and Japan, and would have contributed to instability had they not stepped ahead of the curve and came up with the East Asian Strategy Initiative, which later morphed, I would say, into the pivot of the Obama administration, and now may be the lingering shadow behind the free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, let's focus on what we can do about this big gap between the security midget and the economic giant. This process of looking for a pan-Asian security mechanism has been underway, again, since the early 90s. One of the first efforts at this was by Mahathir Mohamad, who's, if you're interested, he's 92 and running for office in Malaysia still. He came up with this in the United States at that time, big-footed him. We just said, no, we're not going to cooperate. That probably wasn't the right approach at that time. We really should have been ourselves always trying to put forward or to nurture others to put forward ideas about security mechanisms that meet a felt need but have to overcome huge hurdles. And you know the hurdles. The Asia-Pacific Rim is very diverse. The security priorities of the people are as diverse as the diets of the various populations around the rim of China. There's the continuing problem When the United States suggests something, China will reject it. And if China rejects something, the region is nervous about Chinese priorities. So it falls on the regional states to provide those ideas. ASEAN has been valiant, although its own diversity is an inhibitor to a comprehensive kind of security mechanism. They insist on centrality. That's not something that we need to reject. Northeast Asia has been an outlier in trying to find a kind of security mechanism. There was a time when, in the early 2000s, we had thought maybe the six-party talks would accomplish something and could become the basis for a crisis management tool in the region, and maybe could somehow be attached to the ASEAN mechanisms so that we can deal with crisis in the respective sub-regions or more broadly regionally. This has not been easy. I think one of the metaphors that occurred to me as we're watching President Trump's and what I say to visitors in Washington from overseas is don't pay attention to the tweets, just try to follow the underlying policy. It's sort of like the crazy King George III, who kept transplanting bushes around his garden because he didn't like the way they looked, but he couldn't change the underlying ground. And Trump is in a similar position. He's trying to change things, but the fundamentals won't change. In the absence of U.S. leadership, which you remarked on, and in a period when China is becoming, at least in an optical sense, more threateningly different and apart from the values that people had hoped that China might adopt. This is really an important time for Japan and South Korea to find a way to lead. But we all know the inhibitions that trip up Japan-Korean events. But I still think there's an agenda out there. We have, with security implications, there are economic institutions which Japan and Korea and the United States can be led by Japan and Korea and other states into a more constructive approach to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative. We don't have to join the Belt and Road Initiative, but it ought to be opened and encouraged. In fact, the verb I would use is co-optation. Get as many people of common values in the liberal international order into and interacting with the Belt and Road Initiative, the AIIB, and the other newly developed quasi-multilateral development banks that are emerging to try to shape the values of those organizations so that they, if not just reach a higher level of interaction with the client countries to whom they loan money and with whom they develop projects, but will also create opportunities for our services firms. We don't build railways anymore in the United States, and those of you who've been on our railways wouldn't want us to build your railways. But we do still have high-level financial services, good engineering services, and we should be in those, providing those kinds of services, as should Japan and Korean firms as well. Again, co-optation is the key word. There's no ready security formula in the more specialized security realms. A couple of years ago, Xi Jinping went to his first meeting of the CICA and tried to promote the Asian security for Asians, which would have, we believe, excluded the United States. South Korea, at that time, its representative stepped up and prevented that from becoming a common statement. And that's the kind of role I'm thinking of, where you engage yourself in these organizations to prevent them from becoming inimical to our common interests and to make an effort, again, gradually and over time, to draw them into more coordination with interests that we can identify in common. And I would extend that to this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to the cooperation with ASEAN. In China, there's if China has an idea on this, it's going to have problems, and if we have an idea, it's going to be rejected by China. So really any Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia should each, in their own way, seek levels of common membership in the existing but inadequate mechanisms. Try to influence those with standards and goals established from within. And at the same time, this is a kind of schoolyard practice for the alternative. And if this doesn't work out, we're going to probably have to fall back on a concert of power or balance of power in the region. And the more we can exercise cooperation on the common values and attempt to institutionalize, the better prepared we'll be if, against our hopes, China goes down the path toward a militarization that's comparable to something we've seen historically as a result of their ideological redirection. And we're faced with no choice but to unite in opposition to China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. There's a lot of food for thought in what you've said there. Next, we are very fortunate to have with us Danny Russel, who's currently with the Asia Society Policy Institute, and for a considerable length of his career has had hands-on experience in managing all of the issues that we've been talking about so far. So, Danny, over to you.
Thank you very much, Evans. And I agree with Doug Paul's point that it's very hard for the countries of Northeast Asia as a sub-region to find collaborative solutions to problems. And it comports with my own experience in the East Asia Summit, where ASEAN really served as the organizer, the kind of playing ground, the playing field. And the geometry in the East Asia Summit was such that the United States and China, Russia, Japan, Korea, India, all were partners, all were participants, as opposed to a series of bilateral antagonistic wrangling or subgroup wrangling, although there was plenty of that. But if you're looking at Northeast Asia, what do you see? You see Japan, Taiwan, not a country, but an important player, the Republic of Korea, India, Mongolia, all free market democracies. China is not, Russia is not. And DPRK, to my mind, is in a category of its own. It's such an outlier, it's such an anachronism. It's not part of a competing system, I don't think. Russia and China have a not inconsiderable amount of overlap in their systems and their approach. At times they make common cause to resist the US, to resist Western pressure, but they are very, very different. I think Russia seeks actively to disrupt and destabilize the liberal order. My own view is that China is really seeking to build in some circuit breakers that insulate it and its core interests from the pressures to conform with universal principles and international law. Russia's military, Russia's economy are atrophying. China is the opposite. They're growing. They're both totalitarian states, but China is run by a party. Not a Russia expert, but looks from a distance like Russia is run by Putin and some cronies. China is unmistakably a major player in Northeast Asia and the Asia-Pacific region. It's hard to make that case for Russia. The global contest that is emerging, in my view, is not between the US and China. It's really between the principle of universality and the model of regional spheres of influence. And there are, as pertains to China and the United States, two big variables. On the part of the United States, can the US retain the faith, the confidence, the support of other nations that it traditionally has enjoyed? And with regard to China, will, in fact, China be able to exempt itself from rules and norms that happen to be inconvenient? Although there's a lot of talk about China offering a competing model, it's not my sense that the community of common destiny is really that, an alternative model. Xi Jinping has been careful to emphasize Chinese characteristics, that every country has its own development path. It doesn't seem to be proselytizing. But as I said, China increasingly is invoking core interests and awarding itself a kind of exemption, a waiver from global rules and norms. The obvious case in point being the International Law of the Sea Tribunal ruling. And increasingly, China is powerful enough to succeed in some cases. And as has been noted throughout the conference, China also today sees opportunities to open space, to occupy space that has been opened up by U.S. Retreat or U.S. missteps. So there's, to me, after 3 decades as a U.S. diplomat, an incredible irony that the United States, the champion of the multilateral system, is now insisting on bilateralism, and China, which has pursued bilateralism as a mode of self-protection, whether it's at Davos or in Da Nang, is now the champion of the multilateral system. But I think the key question in Northeast Asia is, if China is going to, in fact, fill the void left by American retrenchment, what are the tools that China will use to motivate and to lead other nations? Will they be coercive tools? Will they be economic levers? Or can China build consensus around common interests and around principles that other countries can identify with? And if so, what are those principles, not just development? What are the interests here? So the way I would put it is there going to be an export model of the China dream? And if so, what is it going to look like? And will countries in the region rally behind it or not? Thanks.
Very thoughtful and very provocative, particularly that last point, and we'll talk some more about that. Next, Soeya Yoshihide from Keio University has been always a thoughtful and a valuable voice on many of the issues that we've touched on so far. So let me turn the mic over to him, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to basically talk about three things. One is obvious point about the critical importance of the future of the Korean Peninsula for a bigger regional order. And secondly, your question, Evans, how we look at Trump and its policy in the context of the subject matter that we are discussing. And thirdly, importance of Korea-Japan. And well, I'll be brief about the first point because I think it is too obvious to say this, but to dig into this is of course very difficult conceptually as well as practically, which is how the Korean Peninsula affairs fare in the future. And if unification is somewhat an end point, if only theoretically, then I think we can argue that we are now at a very critical stage because of North Korean overtures. And of course, opinions diverge as to the extent to which North Korea is strategically committed to what they are saying now, or it is only cosmetic and tactical, and they would soon revert to the original position. And maybe it's not fair to say this, but I think we can really not decide between these two. And so my sort of academic point of view is to, I think it's worth betting on the first sort of scenario, that is North Korea commitment to the current change of course is somewhat strategic and will continue for the time being. Then at the end point of unification, this involves a scenario of US withdrawal. according to their preferences. And as I said yesterday, I think China basically has no problem in this ultimate endpoint. And whether we will get into that process or we will revert to what the case used to be, North Korea going back to the previous policy of further developing nuclear weapons and so forth, I think it is a very critical juncture. And secondly, about Trump, I think I also have had a similar view as what T.J. Pempel said yesterday in the intervention. That is because of American change under Trump administration of regional global policies, I think world politics, international politics has become somewhat regionalized. And in regional context, of course, Soviet Union is important toward the east. And in our region, of course, importance of China has risen in that overall structure changes. And so I think as a result of China factor becoming important, I think there is also the flip side of the same coin. That is cooperation among Asian countries residing in the vicinity of China is also becoming very critical in dealing with this regionalization process and of course in dealing with China. And in talking about regional schemes or cooperative policies, there are two sort of two paradigms, so to speak. One is the context in which we talk about the region with China as an inclusive factor. And the other is for Asian countries without China, and for that matter, the US, talk among themselves about their own regional future. And these two, I think, are going to be totally different games. And of course, whenever we talk about the future of Asia at the time of the rise of China, I think we tend to incline toward the first. That is, of course, very important. But what has been missing, I think, for Asian countries is to talk among ourselves. And in my view, Japan included. And this is an endeavor to think of our region and plan the future of our region among ourselves, who are sort of breathing between the most critical, important countries, which are, of course, China and the United States. And in order for us to do that, I think Korea and Japan hold the key. For this to be effective, and for this to be effective for the region, and including China, hopefully, which would mean, of course, talking among ourselves is not a ganging up against China. We cannot do that. And so our goal and agenda concept should be somewhat modified from somewhat old-fashioned thinking about regional cooperation at the time of rise of China. And I think there is one concrete thing which has evolved, which has been evolving recently. That is TPP-11. And TPP-11, when we talk about this, I think this is Japanese approach also very explicitly. Of course, U.S. used to be the key, of course. And so for the U.S. to come back to this TPP is very important. That's a tone of argument, the central tone of argument about this. But I think if you take a different sort of view to this, approach to this, we can take it as an attempt among Asia-Pacific countries without the US and China to think about and talk about our economic scheme. And this is virtually what's been happening. And so if we sort of reconceptualize TPP-11 in this sort of new context, I think this can be a very important sort of scheme for regional countries to begin to think of our region by ourselves. And of course, how to think of the US and as well as China in this context is, of course, ultimately very critical question for us to discuss. And so in this thinking, I think I would like Korea to join, to make it TPP 12. And for Korea to be able to join this, I think this conceptual shift may be helpful, I think. And so these kind of things, I think, are terribly lacking, but there are great potentials for this sort of middle ground, so to speak, between China and the United States, to be cultivated by regional countries, by ourselves. And I hesitate to say this, but maybe I have to. I'm expected to say this. This is what I wanted to mean by Japan's middle power strategy, in fact. Whether Japan is a great power or not, that's okay. But this is how you use your resources for what sort of political and economic sort of agenda and strategy. And Japan-Korea partnership, I think, is really the key for this kind of thing to evolve into a scheme to become an infrastructure, regional infrastructure, so to speak, and upon which we talk about our region in the common language, common consensus, and then we'll be able to talk about China in the same sort of language and concept, and that will bring about sort of future stable, prosperous Asia, including China, eventually. But in the process leading there, I think we need to talk among ourselves. And Japan-Korea holds the key, in my view.
Thank you. I asked for forward-looking and future-oriented, and you gave it to us. Thank you very much, and we'll talk about that some more. We can't talk about any of this, though, without hearing the Chinese view, and to express that view, a longtime friend and colleague, and we're glad to have you with us, Wang Dong from Beijing University. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Evans. I would like to join our panelists again, also to thank ASEAN for inviting me to this very important, marks the 10th anniversary of the ASEAN Forum. It is truly my privilege and honor to be here and join this very important discussion. I understand that I was meant to be invited to join the party. I didn't mean to be the party breaker, but from an intellectually point of view, scholarly point of view, I'm willing to play a little bit the role of devil here. I wanted to offer a bit of more sort of provocative intellectual reflection of this whole overarching concept, liberal international order per se. I actually would argue that the liberal international order, LIO, it is not accurate nor sufficient. This sweeping concept is not accurate nor sufficient for comprehending the nature, the dynamics of the order, how it evolved and what it is about and where it is going, and to interpreting a lot of states' behavior and also predicting its future direction. So I wanted to be a bit more critical of this, a lot of actually underlying assumptions about this concept. So we can think about the origins of the so-called liberal international order after World War II. It's really not a so-called sweeping liberal international order to begin with. Right? Yes, there are liberal elements of that, particularly in the multilateral sort of economic trade system, IMF, World Bank, which of course was built with the leadership of the United States and joined by its allies and others. But then one of the key sort of pillars of the existing current international order, United Nations, by no means is liberal sort of instrument or liberal institution. The Security Council, the core of that, it's actually built, my understanding, based on the idea of a concept of power. So it's a veto power. It by no means is liberal in that sense, and then China has never been part of that order, nor was Soviet Union, because we were in the Cold War at that time. So very much from the very beginning, it's kind of imagined order. The mostly Western powers, United States, its allies believe this should be the way the whole world will be evolving, and therefore, and at the end of the Cold War, of course, there was strategic engagement policy by the United States toward China, and then we were just discussing about the the currently changing U.S. policy or sort of sentiment in the United States toward China. From as an outsider, my impression is that a lot of that disappointment or anxiety about China really comes from this underlying assumption of this whole engagement strategy, which is China, United States opens up to integrate China into the order it is leading, and then over time China will become more like us, quote unquote us, the United States and its allies, and that doesn't happen. It didn't happen. So that, I think, really leads to a lot of the dissolutions or emergent consensus in the policy community in the United States, which basically people trash out engagement, criticize engagement as is being too naive, really not working, and the problem of that is that it begins with this underlying assumption that you want to have to be a quote-unquote liberal democracy to be a legitimate member of this liberal international order. Otherwise, I was joking with my students. It created a situation like a quantum physics. So is China in or not in the current existing order? You may say, yes, of course, physically China is in one of the second largest economy. How can you say China is not in this order? But then from on the implicit assumption, if you begin with that, then China is not legitimate because China is not liberal democracy by Western definition. So it's created this a bit of an ironic situation, and also leading to something I would argue it's almost like the sentiment that West owns property rights of the existing international order, and China and others, you have to behave well, to be qualified to get in. And every behavior of China and others would have to be scrutinized, human rights and other things, market economy. And then, they'll become the judgment that, okay, you are still not yet qualified to be a legitimate member of the international, liberal international order. Then it also leads to I think this ironic situation that you have something incomplete to begin with and something incomplete to as of now. And if that, I think my criticism of the liberal international order is that conceptually speaking, it's not sufficient to really capture what are the key elements, the things that are building blocks of the current order we are in. And it almost leads to unintentionally or intentionally exclude China out of this current order. And that, of course, will be very pragmatic. I'd like to also cite here a parable from the Asian China. It is about a Confucian scholar gentleman. They used to carry a sword when they're walking on the street. So one gentleman carrying a sword, he actually bought on a ferry. He wanted to get across the river to another side. And then all of a sudden he sort of dropped his sword into the river. All other passengers cry out, sir, 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 watch out, you dropped your sword into the river, you better try to retrieve it. And his response was, no worry. All I need to do is to make a mark on the side of the boat, and as soon as I get it to the other side of the river, I just jump in, from this carve, and I will get back my sword. Of course, it will not happen because scene have already changed. So this is a very famous parable in the Chinese literature, and I think it can be used to also to think about the American criticism of why China, you didn't become a liberal democracy, because this is precisely the mark you make on the side of the boat, and you hope, you wish that you believe that you are going to retrieve that, but retrieve the lost sword, the sort of changing international order. But you will not get that because that's not supposed to be the way how things will work out. So my argument here is that if we are willing to, if we see the problems in underlying assumptions of liberal international order, and also we see how it unnecessarily increases zero-sumness in the system. When we using that sweeping concept to conceptualize the world we are in, we see a lot of increased, zero-sumness, because unless you have China and other members change in ideological terms, political system, otherwise you always feel like there's us versus, them, other sort of in-group, out-group sort of mentality out there. And that assumption also doesn't allow the diversity in the pathway toward modernity. So basically, the underlying assumption is that there's only one pathway to modernity, which is Western-defined liberal democracy. Otherwise, any other pathway toward that will be regarded as illegitimate, something weird, irregular. Something has to be sort of really perceived as threatening, because this concept simply doesn't allow you to understand what really is going on. So my suggestion, now moving to my last part. First we have to change, relax a little bit that assumption, and I think it's better just to change to another term, simply like existing international order, instead of using this sweeping concept of liberal order. Or some people say, I think it's a mosaic or multi-layered or multi-order. I was in Brussels last month. There was European scholar who advocating using the term multi-order. I think it also makes a lot of sense. So essentially, I understand. I think Evan's question is asking about the future international order, where it will be going. And a lot of our panels, distinguished panelists, are discussing about the future of regional order. And that, of course, closely interlinked together. And I think I would argue that currently, when we see that, of course, a lot of overlaps, a lot of elements, building blocks already out there, ASEAN-based architecture, East Asia Summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, and above all, of course, there's a US-led hub-and-spoke system. The problem is that, again, goes back to, that is not compatible with China, because there's no position. Unless China say, okay, can we form a military alliance between China and the United States? And that's not going to happen anytime soon, right? So the hub-and-spoke system that is not compatible with China. So we have to think about a future regional order. Really, that is, I also fully agree with Dan and other panelists. We should reject this idea of pursuit of sphere of influence, broad competition, etc. But the future order, it has to be broad enough rather than narrow. It has to be inclusive rather than closed. It has to be open rather than closed, inclusive rather than exclusive. And it has to be also multilateralism, based on multilateralism instead of unilateralism or simply just bilateralism. So with that, I think, idea in mind, I would argue that we better just think about the evolutionary sort of approach toward how the regional order will be evolving, and also broadly speaking, how the international order will be evolving. And lastly, I would goes back to very quickly. I will finish because Dan posed this excellent question. Whether or not China is thinking about exporting its own, or whether or not there's this exportable China model out there, and if so, what China want to do and what others' reaction will be to that. My own understanding is that China really has no, of course I do not speak for the Chinese government, just as a scholar, my own scholar observation. I really don't think Chinese government, China has a stomach for quote unquote exporting its own model. Nor I think the capacity actually of doing that. I think, I was joking with my American colleagues, the world actually is fed up with one American hegemony. So it doesn't want another one, and China does not to be that another one, to be hated by the world. So I think it's last year, some of you might know that the Chinese Communist Party hosted a World Party Congress, and President Xi delivered a very important speech there. I was actually there. I was sitting in the audience as a representative from a scholarly community. I just heard he said so clearly, he said, China does not import models from other countries, nor do we want to export models to others. He actually very much hold the view, as Dan also argues, that we should allow more diversity in every country should pursue the kind of path way forward in accordance with its own domestic situation. I think that's really the Chinese kind of view when it comes to about whether or not there's the issue of China model. So by closing, I just want to argue that if we just to start thinking more critically about the underlying implicit assumption about this whole concept, liberal international order, our conversation, our dialogue, and our debate about the future of international order might just become more productive. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. As I hoped you would, you have very frankly and eloquently highlighted the elephant in the room yesterday and today, which is this idea, as you've put it, that we have a massive country, China, 1.4 billion people, that is not a liberal democracy. And here we are talking about the preservation and maintenance of a liberal international order, an order into which, as you suggested, China does not fit very smoothly, to put it politely. I suspect there's going to be a reaction to that by others on the panel, and others will have a view about that. And I encourage them to respond. And in particular, if others on the panel could respond to that in the context of the fact that as we look at this liberal international order, we often define it in terms of values that most people think China does not necessarily share. And so let me open up the floor for amplifications and rebuttals to the point that Wang Dong just made. And maybe Doug, do you have a thought along those lines?
I'm acutely conscious of the fact that the wave of suspicion of China that's preoccupying the American government today, and many of the circles of people, as Wang Dong said, used to believe that China was going to follow a liberal path, and now they're disappointed. The people are cherry-picking what they're reading. You can take things from Xi Jinping's 19th Party Congress speech and say it's an export of the model, or you can look to the party conference where he denied that and subsequent meetings. One of the problems I have is that every time I think I've gotten to the core of it, and China is saying it's got a proud way of doing business and others are welcome to learn from it, but they're not trying to force feed it on neighbors who are going to be unreceptive. And then we get these news shows and pictures of the leadership that take me back to the 1930s. The uniform leader of China, tens of thousands of troops marching in goose-step fashion. I guess that's a question for you, Wang Dong, or for anybody. Why do they combine these things? Aren't they the least bit sensitive that this martial image projected of China, most recently 58 ships lined up in the South China Sea to show China's new nautical power in the South China Sea and to China's neighbors. Don't they see the negative side of sending that kind of message and what it would do to reinforce efforts by China's neighbors to coalesce to protect themselves from a more aggressive China?
You want to respond?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think you're right. I think they are, of course, I have to keep my response really brief here, but just wanted to say that I heard a lot of American colleagues quoting the 19th Party Congress report, saying, well, this is the smoking gun evidence that China no longer have his ambition, wanted to kick off the United States out of the room and occupy the center stage, and therefore become the next hegemon in line. I think that's not really. I don't know. I don't want to criticize them, because I know many of them are very, they all understand Chinese manner very well. But my own reading as a Chinese scholar is really center stage. It only says close to that. That's number one. And number two, think about center stage. Doesn't say there only have to be one, hegemonic power in that stage. Well, there are actually the realities that a group of global leading power, and I would argue that China, at that center stage, I would argue that personally, I would argue that it would take at least another 10, 15, 20, even 30 more years for China to fully become a full-fledged global leading power, has a global reach, now China has a lot of very sort of idealistic sort of vision, including the shared community, shared future of a community of mankind. But China, have to be very honest, does not yet have the capacity to provide so much global public goods as the United States does. That's very frank reality, fact. And another thing, is China. Bragi also mentioned about this whether or not China's basically development in China's military capability or build up, whether or not leads to more suspicion, anxiety, in the neighbors. I think I also recognize, yes, to some extent, really, it is happening. But also because might is guilt, right, as the saying in the West goes. But, you think about the United States, what it did since the end of World War II. Of course, the United States is also one of the most powerful country, militarily speaking, economically speaking, at the time. And then you just do, this is, John Eckenberry's argument, and he's one of the key person who really coins this term, liberal international order, scholarly. And then you have to really to bind yourself into an institution, right? And then in so doing, in the process of doing that, reduce the suspicion, mistrust of other members of the international community. And this is a success, I think, story, experience of the United States. And I would argue that China would have to do the same thing to learn to become one of the global leading power in the coming decades. So no doubt, Chinese military power, including military power, will continue to grow, develop. But still, to be very honest, I think there's no match to the United States. There's still a significant gap to that. And but also, I would argue that China needs to do more in terms of provision of regional and global public goods. For instance, just think about back 10, 15 years ago when there's a tsunami in Indonesia, China was not able to send single soldier to really help China, and then we asked Singapore to help. Actually, we sort of brought on their helicopter and performed the rescue missions and things like that. But in the coming years, I firmly believe that China would be in a much better position, more prepared situation to provide, in terms of provision of regional public goods. And I also believe that over time, as that kind of inaction, pattern in action really grows, the intensities and frequencies of that really grows. They will create this at the system level. I think people's perception, belief will change significantly over time. I tend to be optimistic about that.
Thank you. Let me bring, if I can, Professor Lee into the conversation. Soeya-san earlier gave us a picture of the importance of cooperation among the regional actors, in particular cooperation between Japan and the Republic of Korea. in the interest of maintaining and strengthening the liberal international order. Obviously, that's been a problematic relationship over the years. We've had ups and downs. Please, if you would, if you could react to his idea and give us your sense of the prospects for the sort of cooperation that he outlined.
Okay, so but let me tackle this, the question you raised in the beginning, that whether or not South Korea believes the U.S. continue to engage in the region. So actually, I can speak for the whole Korea. Actually, to the best of my knowledge, there's no one in Korea that questions that the U.S. engagement in Korean Peninsula or Northeast Asia. The question we have is that how U.S. will engage with this region and Korean Peninsula. So basically, in terms of U.S. Continuation of leading liberal order in Northeast Asia and worldwide, is basically we have to take a look at two dimensions. The first one is domestic dimension of the U.S. As you know, we have a panel discussion yesterday about the question of whether or not Mr. Trump effect is some kind of event, one-time event, or that basically reflective of this underlying social change in the U.S. So that's the one that we have to keep tracking. The other one is whether or not there's the one event or not. There's the liberal order, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that basically hinges on socio-economic inequality, socio-economic equality. So therefore, somehow the U.S. and others, or East Asia and Japan and Korea, have to address this particular issue for sustaining liberal order in Northeast Asia. But international dimension, U.S. cannot ignore East Asia or Northeast Asia. Economically, politically, or strategically, militarily, it's impossible. Then the question is whether U.S. how U.S. will engage in the region, and then basically the liberalism is a good framework under which as Soeya mentioned that Japan and Korea and the U.S. can work together. So that's a good umbrella, and then that's a way to share some kind of collective commitment to sustaining liberal order. But that's another one. But still, another interesting point is that recently, basically, liberalism is something that constitutes U.S. In other words, that's something that U.S. holds as a trademark. Nowadays, but President Xi of China is, at least at a rhetorical level, he, basically tried to portray liberal order. So in other words, in the future, U.S. has to compete with China to reclaim liberalism in Northeast Asia. That's my, ironic observation. So, but in terms of U.S., Korea and Japan cooperation, I guess that's indispensable to not only economically, but also, two partners can work together to have a, carve out a space between the U.S. and China. In other words, we can play middle power politics in between these two powerful countries, and then basically you can lead to this some more forums and talk, and you can basically open up more space for positive engagement. Okay.
Glad to hear a positive comment about the prospects for Japan-Korea cooperation. The subject of alliances and security arrangements has come up, and Wang Dong in his earlier comments, there was an implicit criticism of the hub and spoke security system, if I understood you correctly. I wonder if maybe I could ask the other members of the panel to react to that and to the prospective role that the U.S.-centric security system in the region could play under various iterations of the liberal international order going forward. And maybe if I could ask Soeya-san to begin with a comment about that, about the role and continuing utility of the alliance system, or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, thank you. I think you read my mind. That's what I was going to talk about. I mean, liberalism and realism are not antithesis to each other. Liberalism is grounded in realism. Otherwise, liberal things would not unfold. And so I think the importance of the alliance with the United States in the context of the subject that we are talking about, creating the Liberal International into the future, are the set. And in my sort of pet idea of regional countries talking to each other and coming to some reasonable, comfortable consensus as to the nature of our region and the future, I mean, this endeavor is not sustainable without the American guarantee of the basic balance of power structure. So these are not contradictions to each other. So I think this point is terribly important in public debates because there is a tendency to look at these two as somewhat contradictory to each other. And so in that sense, this is a set. And fortunately or unfortunately, I think this is because of the rising power of China. No matter how hard Chinese colleagues try to assure us, of course the question is Chinese neighbors cannot be fully assured. And this reminded me of a kind of remark made by Singaporean diplomats a few years ago at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which was reported in somebody's blog, and I didn't hear it directly, but it said, that Singaporean said, I don't think China wants to rule the world. They simply wants to rule us. And so the approach toward Asian neighbors and the approach to global institutions and so forth may be different. And here, of course, if you're a suspect of China, you may want to argue that once they control Asia, then their ambition would go globally. But I personally don't think so. They continue to play sort of global games at the global level on the basis of mechanisms and rules which the Liberal International Order has tested. But they are challenging from within those established institutions, such as WTO and so forth. But in Asia, story may be different. So that's a fundamental worry of many Asians. And the Chinese are often very tactful in using what they are doing at the global level, at the universal level, in convincing Asian neighbors. So that's the kind of gap, I think, which Asian neighbors have on the one hand, and Chinese people believe as to the nature of their power in the region. And in order to fill that gap, of course, we have to eventually talk to the Chinese. But as I said, before doing so, we have to do our homework among ourselves. So, sorry, I may be repeating the same thing. But the alliance, again, is very critical. But if I could be a little bit future-oriented, I mean, Japan has been bearing, I think, unproportionately huge burden of the American military presence, no question about it. And if only theoretically, if what I perceive to be future dream of Asia would come true, then that would be the time when American military presence could be shared among Asian countries. And that's the way how Japan could reduce its burden, I think. I tend to put Okinawa problem in this regional context, again, theoretically. But practically, it's beginning to happen. If you look at Australians' decision to accept American Marines in rotation, this is a virtual sort of co-hosting of American presence. And I think that we are moving in that direction. And so to capitalize on those potentials and to make them realize, in having a long-term perspective, I think that is a common sort of issue between Japan and South Korea as well as other countries.
Okay. Thank you for that. I don't know who's going to rule the world, but I know that the clock is ruling us, and I think we've got about 10 or 11 minutes left. So why don't we go ahead and open up the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, and I think mics are going to be coming around. Please identify yourself. If you have a question for a specific individual, please address it to that individual. And I think Patrick Cronin, I saw your hand come up first, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you, Evans. I wanted to ask a question really of the entire panel about what they think the guiding principles or concepts for the three key Northeast Asian countries of ROK, Japan, and China will be going forward. So what's the concept that will bind them together in cooperation or lead to more cooperation, or how they'll manage that going forward? And obviously American thoughts on that are still welcome as well.
Please, Professor Lee. Guiding concepts, guiding thoughts in the region?
Actually, I mean, that's a very tough question. Actually, that's maybe when you mentioned that the importance of guiding principle for international politics, there are several ways we can respond. Number one is that doesn't matter from traditional realist point of view. But today we have a liberal order and we have values and all this. So basically, one thing I can come up off the top of my head is that in Northeast Asia, the way we conduct ourselves in the past, one of the key cornerstones of cultivating our relationship is separation of economics and politics. China did open door policy, and the US and others embraced this open door policy on the basis of this normal separation of politics and economics. But nowadays, we have many economic sanctions within the regions. So therefore, I guess one way we can buttress and support liberal order, as well as also, buy some time to come up with some kind of guiding principle you talk about. We need to go back to this old practice of separating economics from politics.
Thank you. Wang Dong, I think you actually touched on this in your remarks when you were talking about some guiding principles, including inclusive and broad. Any other thoughts along those lines? And then I'll come to Soeya-san.
Very quickly, I think, I just talk about those parameters, which I believe should be the guiding sort of principles, like inclusiveness, right, openness, transparency, and also this idea of multilateralism, etc. And I also would argue that I think this China, Japan, South Korea, this trilateral sort of three countries should be playing the leading role in trying to, I think, how to further lead the Northeast Asia, and of course, along with other stakeholders, United States and others, to lead the regional Northeast Asia, first of all, toward more stable, peaceful, and prosperous region. And I would argue that now there is actually a window of opportunity opening for us, and we just have to work very hard, try to seize it. Yeah.
Soeya-san?
Well, I think one big problem in this trilateral cooperation is each country seems to have different objectives. And Chinese objective is, of course, to harmonize our relations on the basis of Chinese regional worldview, I would assume. And Koreans have, I don't hear this recently, but used to say this trilateral thing is important for Korea to play an intermediary role between China and Japan. Prevent their hostile relations or conflict from disturbing the region. And the Japanese approach has been, of course, there are different views, but maybe central thinking has been for Korea and Japan to set a bit high standard with which China would eventually comply. So it's a scheme to engage China in liberal international order, if you will. And so how to sort of coordinate, these views? I think that still remains the issue. So it depends on circumstances. I think each country may have some kind of strength in asserting their position. But if China doesn't like it, of course China doesn't cooperate. And if Japan doesn't like it, then Japan may not be enthusiastic. And it should be the same for Korea. So how to fill that gap, I'm not sure. But as a Japanese, I think it's not a bad thing for Japan and Korea to set, somewhat high standard in terms of liberalization of trade and so forth, and then talk to the Chinese. And but of course, Chinese response may be different.
Thoughts from my American colleagues on that?
Sure. Well, in the lapsed and now resumed trilateral engagement among the three countries, the operating principle is let's make money. It's an economic trilateral coordination. I think there's an implicit second principle at work also, which is try to ensure that the other two countries don't have closer relations to each other than you have with them. In other words, try not to be the odd man out among the troika. Hey, while I have the floor, I have to ask Professor Wang if he will grant me the intellectual property rights to the phrase, the lost sword of the liberal international order, because he's made me want to write a book just so that I can use that title.
That's better than the North Korean treasured sword of deterrence, I guess. But anyway, Doug?
Our various journalist colleagues were all writing that down when he said it, so you better move quickly because I think they're going to be borrowing it. I have a kind of a simple-minded response to your question, Patrick, which is that I would look very closely at the OSCD organizing baskets and see which ones of those are appropriate for an Asia community to adopt in common. And human rights will be a particularly difficult one vis-a-vis China. And the OSCE got established in the absence of commercial connections with the former Soviet camp. And so that will be a very different context because of the thick interdependency of the economies. But I think that, for me, would be a starting point.
That's a good point. We have time for a quick question. This gentleman up here, 1, 2, 3, 4th row back in the middle.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Jong-Hun Lee, currently working for Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat. When I am talking about Trilateral Cooperation, it means China, Japan, and Korea. There are so many similar trilateral things. Many people are wondering about the future prospect of trilateral cooperation. So unfortunately, we do not have the crystal ball to predict the future exactly. But generally speaking, there are two aspects, of course, negative and positive. As far as negative, the factor is concerned, we can think of historical dispute, territorial dispute, historical issue, territorial dispute, and negative perception toward each other. But more fundamentally, maybe a power shift or transition caused by China rising from international power politics point of view. So in the process of three countries pursuing their own strategic goal, nobody cannot deny that the role of diplomacy is most important. So I'd like to hear any panelist of my long-standing question, how do you define the good diplomacy? Thank you.
Group diplomacy, interesting concept. Thoughts, responses? Please, Professor Lee.
Okay, so I try to give you my unconventional definition of diplomacy. Actually, there's a scholar called James Doderian in the field of international politics, and he wrote a book in mid-1980s on diplomacy. And he defines diplomacy in terms of a way to lessen estrangement and alienation among nation states. So good diplomacy is to reduce alienation, estrangement toward each other.
Soeya?
I would rather say kind of wise diplomacy, perhaps. And there's another panel which is going on Southeast Asia, I understand. And I wonder we can sort of emulate ASEAN way among three of us, start with kind of easy things and build up habit of cooperation. And I think this is what Trilateral Secretariat is doing virtually. And the hope is, it's already become a cliche to say that hope is among the younger people. And I understand when you go out to get staff people to be employed. There are quite a few applicants from Korea and China, right? All the time, and very little from Japan, and which is a shame for us. But which means there is a strong reserve of kind of people, young people, who are enthusiastic about trilateral cooperation, and perhaps because they know there are difficult problems. And when they get together, I often bring my students to Korea, regularly, and when they get together, of course, with known difficult problems, of course, they don't agree. But this will bring them to the next stage. That is, why we have that problem, and we should do something about it. So I think that kind of willingness to do something about difficult things is very obvious among young people. So I think wise diplomacy is to solicit those people and to create sort of habit of cooperation, and which would, I think this is an indirect strategy to deal with difficult questions eventually, I think, rather than taking them up today.
Wisdom, diplomacy, and relying on the energy of the youth. On that rather positive and forward-looking note, let me bring this session to a close. And please, if you would, join me in thanking our excellent panelists here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now take a 15-minute coffee break. The last session of Asan Plenum 2018 will take place in this room at 3:15. Thank you very much.